You're welcome back to the Rise interview with me, Christian Ogodo. Thanks for staying with us. Silencing the guns in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic remains a big push, even at the Africa Day 2020. As a way of celebrating Africa Day, several African nationals, Africans in the diaspora, as well as descendants of Africa, have organized commemorative cultural events that highlight the vibrancy of African cultures, foods, and traditions. Most of these will be virtual events due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The AU, that is the African Union, also wants to encourage country-level and sub-regional programs of action toward silencing guns in Africa. Here's the President of South Africa and Chair of the African Union, Cyril Ramaphosa, talking about Africa being able to work together to solve its own problems.
We mark this Africa Day in the shadow of the coronavirus pandemic, which has swept across the world and left no part of our continent untouched. Thus far, almost 96,000 people have been infected on our continent, and almost 3,000 have lost their lives. This COVID-19 pandemic will have a lasting impact on our ability to meet the aspiration of the African Union's Agenda 2063 of a peaceful, united, and prosperous continent. This virus has exposed the deep inequalities that continue to exist on our continent and across the world. It has shown how far we are from realizing our developmental goals and our responsibilities to the citizens of our continent. But at the same time, this global crisis should enable a new Africa to come to the fore. It should be an Africa of heroic acts of solidarity, an Africa of cross-border collaboration and sharing of knowledge and resources, an Africa that is united by a common goal. The challenge of this pandemic has shown how Africa is able to work together to solve its own problems. Day by day, across our continent, we are seeing the unity that is our strength being put to the service of saving lives and supporting the vulnerable.
As the Chair of the African Union and President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa there. And for more on this, I've now been joined by Edwin Ikhuoria, the Executive Director, Africa One Campaign. Thanks for joining us, and happy celebration to Africans wherever they may be in the continent and in the diaspora.
Thank you very much for having me. Really happy Africa Day.
57 years on,
Yes.
metamorphosing as the Organization of African Unity to the African Union.
Yes.
Would you say, to a very large extent, that the set objectives in the formation of this continental body has been achieved?
I would say we have made progress. That is my best description would be that we are not where we were before. So with the objectives, the objective for starting in 1960, from 1963 when it started, was to, first of all, it was let us get independence from Europe, right?
Agitation against colonialism and the rest.
Apartheid and all of that. But what we've seen is that even after that, 57 years later, we've been dealing with ourselves, but the consolidation that we're supposed to have achieved have not really fully been achieved. But some major milestones have been achieved. For instance, just last year, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area was agreed upon. That is like the harbinger of the vision of the founding fathers. And Africa, the forerunner to a borderless Africa. That is what we hope to see. So I would say we have moved from where we were to where we are trying to get to right now. And the Africa we want, that we're trying to see, is an Africa without conflict. But today, as we speak, about 14 African countries are still experiencing one form of internal conflict.
Particularly the DRC, with
The
all
DRC is
minerals
there.
in the world found there, they set, you know, the outsiders set them against each other.
So that is on one front. But even the ones that beyond even the fight, what about internal conflicts? That, you know, what you call what we are calling terrorism, as you call it now. You see a lot of people, young people, who are dissatisfied with the status quo because they cannot continue to exist in you know, depravity. So you see an agitation. So it is when there are people who are not satisfied, that is when external influence can actually find its root. So they look for the elements who are not happy with their current situation, and then they can use that to foster, you know, conflict and all the things that we see today. So we've moved, but we still have quite a bit to do to get to the Africa
quite
we
a
want.
bit indeed, because even 57 years, some analysts will tell you that nothing significant has been achieved. There is no borderless Africa. Some countries are shutting down their borders, like Nigeria, because some other countries, you know, use Nigeria as a dumping ground for certain finished products from Europe and America and Asia and the rest. Now they're talking about Agenda 2063.
Of course.
Grandiose, eh?
No, I don't think it is grandiose, because without a vision, you cannot go from where you are. If you cannot determine where you want to be, then it becomes difficult to really organize your tactics or your activities or your tasks to get there.
Shouldn't such targets or growth or development be medium before
Of course,
you talk short-term, medium,
very
and
well,
long-term?
Very well. Even the Agenda 2063 has its own short-term and medium-term plans. So they have what we call the 10-year plan first. Then they have the next medium term that goes on up till the 2063. So there are several projects that have been done, some milestones that have been put along the way. For instance, the CFTA that we talked about, the Common Air that we talked about, are all several milestones that are put in the way to achieve that Agenda 2063. So there are different elements of that as well. So I think it was well thought out. If you see the Agenda 2063, it is well thought out. The milestones are well structured. But of course, here comes COVID. So sometimes you plan internally, you have a vision, you've set your strategy, you want to achieve stuff, and then external, you know, things that you did not budget for just showed up. And this is one of the things where we've just realized now that if you're not preparing holistically, particularly putting a lot of attention to the social sector, like health, education, right? Your plans, you could call them grandiose if you may, but if you put a plan that does not consider the people, the resilience of the social sector, right? That plans can go nowhere. So one disease and everything gets to a halt. Just one disease, an invisible enemy, and where we are today. So you see that. But even with all of this, we still have a cause to celebrate.
Have cause to celebrate. And the continent probably will be celebrating more if they've been able to articulate, you know, having a common currency to back the SIFTA, you know, formation only last year. Why can't, you know, this continent achieve the surge to drive its economic agenda?
No, you must understand that Africa was colonized for over 200 years. So it is not, you cannot just break out of that. There's what we call the path dependency. When you've initiated some structural, institutional barriers to growth, right, it takes some time to deconstruct all of that. So it's about the mindset first, and I think we are currently at this place where...
And politicization, too.
Of course. The mindset drives the politics, the ethnic minority, the ethnic divisions we have, the religious divisions we have. These are all the things, the fault lines that fuel all the politics. So by the time we don't deconstruct those things, all of the things that you think are common sense, common currency and all of that, you cannot achieve them unless you deconstruct those structural barriers.
So integration is difficult to achieve then.
Of course, it is difficult to achieve. The US fought how many civil wars? I mean, huge civil war before they came to become the United States of America, right? So for us to get to the United States of Africa, you can imagine that it takes some time to really synergize on a common agenda, on a common goal. And I think that we're on the path to that. And that's the reason why I think that the response that the African leaders did for COVID-19 still showed that Africa is still a leader in terms of the spirit of Ubuntu, the spirit of solidarity, because Africa came together. We are pulling resources to buy equipment, PPEs, and emergency response things together. That is the only place it is happening right now. Other countries are acting individually, but Africa is acting as a whole. So these are some signs that the spirit of solidarity is still reigning on the African continent.
That spirit is not being translated from the impoverishment of the people, particularly the youth, who constitute well over 60 to 70% of the
Yes,
population
of course.
in Africa.
Yes.
That's a very sore point, in
Very
this organization, the African Union.
Very well. Again, the youth, 60%, and we got about 22% unemployment. This is like talking about, in fact, every year, we get in about 22 million young people who get into the job market, and for which we are creating only 3 to 5 million jobs a year. So what does this mean for us? It means that there's a lot of people, a lot of backlog, a lot of young people who have nothing to do, which is the reason why we say when you want to silence the guns, you have to create employment. There has to be an economic response to silencing the guns. It's not just a military response. It's not just, creating peace missions and all of that, or creating peace and inter-conflict, resolving conflict resolution, those kind of things. You have to think about an economic agenda, and that's the path that we think Africa should be towing right now. How do you create opportunities for the young people? And so the Continental Free Trade Area, again, comes to play. If Africa can trade with itself, can produce by itself. What we just realized with COVID-19, 94% of all the drugs consumed in Africa is imported. 94% of the drugs. So if we are sick, we cannot even take care of ourselves by the medicines because we don't produce. And so these are the kind of things we are hoping that with the COVID-19 is an opportunity we are getting.
Or the flora abounds in the whole of the continents that can, metamorphosed into international certified pharmaceuticals.
Very true.
We're probably not thinking enough in this part of the world.
It's also about the role that the private sector plays. So here, when there's an enabling environment, then people can invest in that sector. But when you have when there's no intellectual property right that is guaranteed and people produce and they see that their products, get faked. Look at our industry, our entertainment industry. See how it is plagued by all of this kind of fakery. So the institutions are not strong enough to protect even private investors in this kind of things. And these are the reasons why the structural review, the structural reforms that need to happen to allow the private sector to make the kind of investment that are needed so that we can produce drugs for ourselves, feed ourselves. These are the things that create the opportunities for the young people themselves. And then we can think about the Africa we want to see.
Thanks so very much. No better place for you to have put a full stop to this conversation.
Thank you
Edwin Ikhuoria, Executive Director of One Campaign. Thanks for coming on the show.